Hello my friends, thank you for being here for the history of the original yellow boot from Timberland. I've never asked this before in any of my videos, but please subscribe if you like this kind of content. The story of Timberland starts with Nathan Schwartz, a Russian immigrant from 3 generations of shoemakers who moved to New York and worked his way up from an apprenticeship for 34 years, honing his craft as a cobbler until 1952 when he purchased a half stake in the Boston-based Abington Shoe Company for $500. 3 years later, in 1955, he bought out his partner, assumed complete control, and enlisted his 2 sons, Herman and Sidney, to overhaul the business, which included relocating to Newmarket, New Hampshire. In 1968, Abington Shoe Company began to innovate using direct injection molding and pioneered the way industrial footwear was manufactured. This significantly ramped up the process of seamlessly bonding soles to uppers to form an impermeable seal. In 1973, to test out his theory of impermeability, Sidney Schwartz submerged a pair of nubuck boots in a toilet and filled them with rocks so they wouldn't float, only to find the next day that they were dry on the inside, and those were the first prototype Timberland yellow boot. In 1976, Abington Shoe Company launched the Timberland waterproof boot. This boot came in a variety of leathers, all waterproof, but the yellow nubuck became the most popular shade, even if the color choice was originally an afterthought. This new boot was heavily branded with the iconic American oak Timberland tree, and this one boot style became so popular and accounted for 80% of Abington sales within 5 years that the Abington Shoe Company officially changed their name to Timberland in 1978. Fun fact, originally 8 inches tall, is the 6-inch model that took over. The original boot was mostly worn by people working in harsh conditions here in the US, but by the 1980s, the popularity began to rise internationally. The New York Times reported that teens were robbing people for their Timberlands in the fashion capital of Milan, and that American flight attendants were scooping up Timberlands to resell for double the price in Italy. Fun fact, the Italian Timberland connection happened because in 1979, a man named Giuseppe Veronesi bought 3,000 pairs to take back to Italy, only to return the next year for 3,000 more. These boots helped kick off the paninaro style that was popular among Italian youth, and even Pet Shop Boys made a song about it called Paninaro. The boot was also a hit in places like Japan and the UK as well. This new popularity created a spike in sales, and in 1988, the Boston Globe reported that Timberland sales had increased from 48 million to 138 million over the previous 5-year period. By 1989, Timberland had opened up its second flagship store on New York's Upper East Side. At the new store, New York City residents began to fall in love with the boot, but the customers weren't who Timberland had expected. It was the youth and people who were into hip-hop that were buying the boot. At this point in history is where my connection to Timberland comes in, because in the 1980s, a lot of New York artists, hip-hop artists, were wearing Dapper Dan outfits, and the first Timberland piece that I saw was a Timberland Dapper Dan jacket. I can't remember who was wearing it. Like I said, a lot of New York artists were wearing Dapper Dan, but that was my first connection. Timberland didn't even make those jackets, Dapper Dan did, but I was intrigued and I wanted to know more about the brand. Timberland continued to be worn by the street savvy into the 90s, even as Timberland CEO Jeffrey Schwartz gave an interview in 1993 with the New York Times, and when asked about urban market share, he contended that black consumers only made up 5% of Timberland's growing sales, which was refuted by many in the business and on the streets. Schwartz went on to tell the Times that while black consumers' money spends good, he was not going to build his business on smoke. There were a lot of boycotts of Timberland after this, and Schwartz wrote an op-ed for the New York Amsterdam News. Schwartz called the Times article character assassination and an attempt to make Schwartz and Timberland look racist. Calls to boycott Timberland were short-lived, and following Schwartz's interview blunder, Timberland realized that being popular among black and other young urban consumers was not a fad, but an opportunity to grow the brand. As Timberland grew throughout the 90s, between 1991 and 2000, Timberland's profits increased from $80 million to over $500 million, and by 2000, revenues passed $1 billion, all in large part due to the yellow boot and the recognition it brought the brand. Between 2006 and 2010, sales at Timberland were stagnant, and the company saw an 8% loss in revenue during that period. In September of 2011, Jeff Schwartz sold the brand for $2.3 billion to fashion conglomerate VF Corporation. The company's headquarters are still in New Hampshire. There are premium collections and made in USA collections of the original yellow boot, but the majority of classic boots are not made in the USA. The original yellow boot doesn't have the mass popularity it once did, but Timberland does do a lot of collaborations with other brands, artists, musicians to keep the boot relevant and on people's minds. Hope you guys enjoyed that brief history of the original yellow boot by Timberland. Till next time, later.